I used to think the hardest moment would be the day I walked away. For a long time, that was the image in my head. The door closing. The silence afterward. The empty feeling that comes when something you built with someone else suddenly isn't there anymore. I thought that would be the worst part. I was wrong. The real war didn't start until after everything was already broken. It's strange how life keeps moving even when something fundamental inside it collapses. The same routines keep happening. The same rooms exist. The same conversations are supposed to feel normal. But they don't. There are small things that disappear without warning. The way people used to speak to you. The way a room used to feel when you walked in. The quiet certainty that if something terrible happened, the people closest to you would stand beside you. I lost that certainty. At first, I thought I had only lost a relationship. That alone felt heavy enough. There were moments early on when I would sit in the quiet of the house and try to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. A life that once felt stable had turned into something fragile almost overnight. I remember thinking that once the truth was out, things would settle. Painful, yes. Complicated, definitely. But at least clear. I believed that once people understood what had happened, they would know where they stood. I believed my family would know where they stood. That assumption didn't last long. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't loud. There was no confrontation, no dramatic moment where someone said the wrong thing. It was smaller than that. A comment that sounded reasonable on the surface. People make mistakes. I remember hearing that and thinking maybe they just didn't understand yet. Maybe they were trying to calm things down. Families do that sometimes. They want peace more than they want conflict. At the time, I let it go. But the comments kept coming. Everyone's hurting right now. You don't want this to turn into something permanent. And my personal favorite. You have to think about the bigger picture. Every time I tried to explain how angry I felt, how confused I was, the conversation seemed to drift somewhere else. Like my reaction was the problem. Like the real danger wasn't what had happened, but the fact that I wasn't letting it go fast enough. It started to feel surreal. I had just learned that someone I trusted had broken that trust in a way that couldn't be undone. But somehow the conversation kept circling back to my tone, my anger, my unwillingness to move on. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe grief just makes everything feel sharper. But then I noticed something that didn't sit right. A hesitation when I mentioned certain topics. A strange kind of defensiveness when I talked about her. It wasn't obvious. Not enough to call out. Just a feeling. The kind of feeling that makes you pause in the middle of a conversation and wonder if you missed something important. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking it. But looking back now, that was the moment things really started to fracture. Not when the relationship ended. But when I realized the people I expected to stand beside me might already be standing somewhere else. Before everything fell apart, my life had a kind of rhythm to it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing perfect. Just steady. The kind of steady you don't question because it feels permanent. We built that life slowly. There wasn't some sweeping beginning where everything happened at once. It was more like two people gradually fitting their routines together until one day it just felt normal to move through the world as a pair. I trusted her. Not the dramatic kind of trust people talk about when they're trying to prove something. Just the quiet kind that shows up in everyday decisions. The kind where you don't double-check things because it never crosses your mind that you should. We had responsibilities together. Bills, schedules, long conversations about what the future might look like. Plans that stretched years ahead in ways that felt safe at the time. Looking back now, that sense of safety is the part that feels the strangest. Because it wasn't fake. At least, it didn't feel fake then. There were plenty of normal disagreements. Small frustrations that happen when two people share a life long enough. But nothing that ever made me question the foundation underneath everything. If anything, I thought we handled problems well. We talked things through. We figured things out. And when things got stressful, there were always other people around us who helped keep things balanced. My family had always been a big part of my life. Not in a controlling way. Just present. Supportive. The kind of family that checks in often and shows up when something important is happening. She became part of that pretty quickly. Family gatherings, holidays, random weekend visits, she fit into those spaces without much friction. People liked her. Conversations were easy. I never felt like I had to defend the relationship or explain it to anyone. It just worked. There was one person in particular in my family who had always been someone I leaned on when life got complicated. He was the type of person who stayed calm in situations where everyone else got emotional. Growing up, I'd gone to him more than once for advice about things I couldn't figure out on my own. Sometimes he'd offer a clear opinion. Other times he'd just listen and shrug a little. Give it time, he'd say. Or, things usually sort themselves out. Simple advice, but it always felt steady. Reliable. When I got into the relationship that would eventually turn into my marriage, he was supportive in the same quiet way he always had been. He never acted overly involved. Never pushed himself into our decisions. But he was around. The kind of presence that makes you feel like if things ever went wrong, you wouldn't have to face it alone. That belief stuck with me for years. Even during moments when the relationship felt strained in small ways, I never doubted that support system. And the truth is, most of the time our life together looked normal. We had routines. Shared responsibilities. Long stretches where nothing unusual happened at all. Looking back, those stretches are the hardest to process now. Because when I replay those years in my head, I can still see the version of my life I believed in. A relationship that felt stable. A family that felt united. Two parts of my world that I assumed would always stand on the same side if things ever got difficult. I never imagined those two things could collide in a way that would leave me standing alone in the middle of it. But at the time, none of that had happened yet. Back then, the idea that trust could break in more than one direction had never even crossed my mind. As the years went on, our lives became more structured. Not in an exciting way. Just in the way life naturally settles when two people share enough responsibilities for long enough. There were routines we didn't even think about anymore. Who handled certain bills? Who picked up groceries? Who called to check on family members? Small systems that formed without discussion because that's what long-term partnerships tend to do. You stop negotiating every detail. You trust the other person to carry their part. I carried mine without thinking twice about it. At the time, that felt like what commitment was supposed to look like. We both worked hard to keep things stable. There were pressures, of course. Life has a way of stacking obligations on top of each other until it feels like you're always one unexpected problem away from chaos. But we managed. When things got tense, we would usually talk through it later, after the heat of the moment had passed. Those conversations weren't always comfortable, but they gave me the impression that we were still moving in the same direction. That belief kept me steady. Our responsibilities weren't just between the two of us either. Our lives were still tied closely to family. Weekend gatherings. Occasional dinners. Phone calls about small things that didn't really matter but somehow kept everyone connected. Those interactions made everything feel reinforced. It wasn't just the relationship standing on its own. It was surrounded by people who knew us, saw us together, and seemed to believe in the stability of what we'd built. The person in my family I'd always trusted remained part of that environment. He had a way of observing things quietly during gatherings. He never pushed himself into conversations about our relationship unless I brought something up first. Sometimes I would. Not about anything major. Just the normal frustrations people talk about when they've been with someone long enough to know each other's habits too well. He would usually listen, nod, and keep his advice simple. Nothing unusual there, he'd say. Or, most couples go through phases like that. Hearing that always reassured me. It made the occasional tension feel normal instead of threatening. And because he had always been someone I trusted growing up, I never questioned the perspective he offered. Looking back now, I realize how much weight I gave those conversations. At the time, though, it felt natural. If anything, I thought his presence helped strengthen the relationship. Having someone level-headed around during stressful moments made it easier to believe that whatever problems came up were manageable. That sense of stability lasted for a long time. But if I'm being honest, there were moments, small ones, that I didn't fully understand back then. Nothing dramatic. Just subtle shifts. There were days when she seemed distracted in ways I couldn't quite explain. Conversations that used to flow easily would suddenly feel shorter. Less open. I noticed it occasionally, but I always found a reason not to dwell on it. Stress from work. Fatigue. The kind of invisible pressure that builds in adult life. Whenever I mentioned those moments, she usually brushed them aside. "It's nothing," she'd say. And most of the time, I accepted that answer. Partly because I wanted to. But also because I had no reason not to trust it. From the outside, everything still looked the same. We still showed up together at family events. Conversations around the table were normal. Laughter came easily enough that no one would have guessed anything underneath the surface was shifting. And whenever I spoke privately with the family member I trusted most, he never suggested that anything seemed wrong. If anything, he encouraged patience. Relationships settle into patterns, he told me once. Sometimes things just feel quieter for a while. That explanation made sense at the time. It gave me permission not to worry. Looking back now, I realize something about trust that I didn't understand then. Trust isn't just about believing the person you're with. It's also about believing the environment around you. The people who watch your life from the outside. The voices that reassure you everything is fine. When all of those signals point in the same direction, you stop looking for problems. And that's exactly where I was back then. Completely certain that the two pillars of my life, the relationship and the family around it, were both standing solidly in the same place. If I try to pinpoint when things started feeling different, I can't give you a single moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden fight, no confession, no event where everything clearly changed. It was slower than that. More like something shifting just slightly out of place. At first it showed up in small ways. Conversations that used to last an hour suddenly ending after a few minutes. Answers that felt shorter than they used to be. Not cold exactly. Just distant. The kind of distance that's easy to explain away. Everyone goes through stressful periods. Work gets overwhelming. People get tired. Life piles up responsibilities until there's not much energy left at the end of the day. That's what I told myself. And honestly, most of the time I believed it. When I asked if something was wrong, the answer was always the same. No, I'm just tired. Or sometimes, it's nothing. There's a strange moment in situations like that where you feel a small signal telling you something isn't right, but you also feel almost embarrassed for noticing it. Like maybe you're looking too closely. Like maybe you're the one creating tension by questioning things that aren't really problems. So I let those moments pass. Life kept moving forward. Work schedules stayed busy. Family events came and went. From the outside, everything still looked the same. But every once in a while there would be a small pause in conversation, or a glance that seemed just slightly out of place, and I would feel that same quiet discomfort again. Nothing I could point to. Just a feeling. The kind of feeling you push aside because you don't want to be the person who assumes the worst. Eventually, though, the feeling got harder to ignore. I remember one night sitting across the room while she was looking at her phone. Nothing unusual about that by itself. People do it all the time. But something about the way she reacted when I walked closer caught my attention. She tilted the screen away slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough that I noticed. When she looked up, her expression was calm. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. And technically, that was true. Nothing had actually happened. But for some reason that moment stayed in my mind longer than it should have. I tried to brush it off. I told myself people are entitled to privacy. Everyone deserves space. Not every message needs to be explained. Still, that quiet discomfort didn't disappear. It just sat there. Weeks passed like that. Maybe longer. Looking back now, I realize that was the stage where doubt first started creeping in. Not strong enough to act on. Not strong enough to accuse anyone of anything. Just enough to make certain moments feel slightly off. Then the truth about the relationship eventually surfaced. Not in some dramatic reveal. More like a series of details falling into place until there was no way to misunderstand what they meant. When I finally understood what had been happening, it felt like the ground had shifted underneath everything I believed about our life together. But as painful as that realization was, I remember telling myself something very clearly at the time. At least I wasn't alone. At least my family would understand. That belief was one of the few things still holding me steady in the middle of everything. And at first, it seemed like it might actually be true. When I explained what had happened, the person in my family I trusted most listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to judgment. He just nodded slowly while I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back and rubbed his hands together for a moment. Then he said something that sounded reasonable at the time. "People make mistakes." I remember sitting there for a second, waiting for him to add something else. Something that acknowledged how serious the situation was. But he didn't. And that was the first moment I felt something inside the situation shift in a way I couldn't fully explain. At first, I tried to tell myself that his reaction didn't mean anything. People process things differently. Some people react emotionally. Others stay neutral. I had known him long enough to understand that he usually leaned toward calm instead of confrontation. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt. If anything, I thought he was just trying to slow things down. Maybe he believed that reacting too strongly would only make the situation worse. For a while, that explanation worked. But over the next few weeks, the conversations started to feel off. Every time I brought up what had happened, the focus seemed to drift away from the betrayal itself. Instead of talking about what she had done, the discussion would turn toward the idea of forgiveness. Or patience. Or not letting anger take over. I remember one conversation where I said, "I'm not sure how I'm supposed to just ignore this." He shrugged slightly. "You don't have to ignore it," he said. "Just don't let it define everything." At the time, that sounded like the kind of advice people give when they're trying to help someone move forward. But there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite name. A subtle shift. Like he was trying to balance both sides of the situation instead of standing clearly on one. I didn't confront him about that feeling. Not then. Instead, I kept trying to explain how disorienting the whole thing felt. How strange it was to discover that the person you trusted most inside your relationship had been living a completely different reality. He listened, nodded, offered a few calm responses. Nothing openly dismissive. But nothing that felt fully supportive either. Eventually I started noticing small details that made the situation feel even stranger. Sometimes when I mentioned her name, he would hesitate slightly before responding. Other times he seemed oddly informed about things I hadn't told him yet. At first I assumed someone else in the family had spoken with him. But the more those moments happened, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. One evening, during a conversation that was already tense, I mentioned something about how quiet she had been since everything came out. He responded without thinking. "She's been overwhelmed." The words landed strangely. I looked at him for a second. "How do you know that?" I asked. He paused. Not a long pause. Just long enough to make the room feel different. "We talked," he said finally. The way he said it was casual. Like it was obvious. I felt something tighten in my chest. "You talked?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said. "A couple of times." The explanation came quickly after that. He said he reached out because he thought someone needed to keep communication open. He didn't want things escalating. He believed that if everyone stayed angry, the situation would only become more destructive. "I'm just trying to keep the peace," he told me. At that moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe that explanation. After all, that was exactly the kind of role he had always played in family conflicts. The calm one. The mediator. But another part of me couldn't ignore how strange it felt. I had just discovered that my relationship had been built on something I didn't fully understand. Now I was learning that one of the people I trusted most had been speaking privately with the person who caused that collapse. And somehow I was the last one to know. I tried to stay calm. "So you've just been talking to her?" I asked. "Just talking," he said. But over time I learned that wasn't entirely true. The conversations weren't occasional. They were regular. Phone calls. Messages. And eventually, meetings. "Coffee," he said once when it came up accidentally. Just to talk things through. That was the moment something shifted inside me in a way I couldn't easily put into words. I wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of a broken relationship anymore. I was dealing with the unsettling feeling that the lines of loyalty around me had quietly moved. When I tried to explain why that bothered me, the responses I received only made the feeling worse. "You're reading too much into it. He's just trying to help. Someone has to keep things from getting ugly." Each explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. But none of them addressed the question that kept echoing in my mind. Why was the person I trusted most helping the person who had just broken my life apart? And why did everyone else seem to think that was perfectly normal? After that conversation, something changed in the way I moved through my own family. It wasn't loud. Nobody declared sides. Nobody said anything openly hostile. But the atmosphere shifted. Once you realize something like that, once you understand that conversations are happening without you, you start noticing things you didn't notice before. Little pauses. Certain topics that make the room go quiet. The way people glance at each other before responding. Family gatherings used to feel easy. You showed up, people talked, food appeared on the table, and everyone settled into the same comfortable rhythm that had existed for years. After everything happened, those gatherings felt different. Not openly tense. Just careful. Conversations would drift toward neutral subjects. Work. News. Random stories that didn't really matter. But whenever the subject came close to my situation, the room would shift slightly. People would clear their throats. Someone would suddenly change the topic. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself that maybe they just didn't want to make things harder for me. Maybe they thought bringing it up would reopen wounds that were still fresh. That explanation worked for a while. But eventually the silence started to feel like something else. Like avoidance. Like everyone had quietly agreed that the easiest way to deal with the situation was to pretend it wasn't as serious as it actually was. One night during dinner, I mentioned that I was still struggling with everything that had happened. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I just said it plainly. I'm still trying to figure out how to move past this. The reaction around the table wasn't what I expected. Instead of understanding, I saw a few uncomfortable expressions. My brother leaned back slightly and sighed. "You can't stay stuck in this forever," he said. I stared at him. "I'm not stuck," I said. "I'm dealing with it." "Yeah," he replied, "but at some point you've got to let it go." The way he said it made it sound simple. Like forgiveness was a switch you could flip whenever you decided you were done being upset. I felt my frustration building. "Let it go?" I said. "You make it sound like someone dented my car." He rubbed his forehead. "That's not what I'm saying." But he didn't really explain what he was saying either. The conversation stalled there. A few seconds passed in silence before someone else started talking about something completely unrelated. And just like that, the moment disappeared. But the feeling didn't. That kind of exchange started happening more often. Any time I expressed anger, it seemed to make people uncomfortable. Not the kind of discomfort that leads to support. The kind that makes people want the conversation to end as quickly as possible. Gradually, I started noticing something else. When my brother spoke about her, his tone had changed. He didn't defend what she had done exactly, but there was always a layer of sympathy underneath his words. "She's going through a lot too," he said once. I remember looking at him and thinking about all those quiet meetings he'd mentioned. All those conversations I hadn't been part of. It made me wonder what version of the story she had been telling him. Or maybe the more unsettling question was whether the version mattered at all. Over time, I stopped bringing the subject up. Not because I had processed everything. But because every conversation about it left me feeling like I had somehow become the difficult one. The angry one. The person who was disrupting the peace everyone else seemed so determined to maintain. Eventually, I started sharing less of my life with them altogether. Shorter visits. Shorter phone calls. More distance. It wasn't a decision I made all at once. It just happened gradually. The strange part was realizing that the isolation didn't come from the betrayal itself. That part had already broken something. What really changed my life was discovering how quickly the people around me seemed willing to step back once the situation became uncomfortable. If you've ever experienced a situation where trust broke in ways you didn't expect, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your perspective. Stories like this always bring out strong opinions, and I'm curious how other people see it. Because looking back now, I still don't have a simple answer. Time has passed since all of this happened. Life has a way of moving forward whether you're ready or not. Eventually routines settle again. The chaos fades into something quieter. But quiet doesn't always mean resolved. For a long time, I kept replaying everything in my head. Not just the betrayal that ended the relationship. But the other betrayal that came afterward, the one I never saw coming. When someone you love breaks your trust, people expect the pain that follows. It's almost built into the story. Relationships fail sometimes. People make decisions that hurt each other. That part, as devastating as it was, eventually started to make sense in its own painful way. What took longer to understand was the way everything else unfolded around it. The way support slowly turned into neutrality. The way neutrality quietly turned into distance. No one ever sat me down and said they were choosing someone else's side. That's not how it happened. Instead, it was a series of small moments. Advice that focused on forgiveness instead of accountability. Conversations that ended quickly whenever I tried to talk about what I was feeling. A constant push toward moving on, even when I was still trying to understand what had happened in the first place. At some point I realized something that changed the way I saw the entire situation. Some people value peace more than they value loyalty. Not because they're cruel. But because conflict makes them uncomfortable. If keeping the peace means standing in the middle instead of standing beside you, that's the position they'll choose. Understanding that didn't erase the hurt. But it did give me clarity. Eventually I stopped expecting validation from people who had already decided their role was to stay neutral. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life that had collapsed when everything fell apart. It wasn't easy. Losing a relationship is painful. But losing the version of your family you thought you had is something else entirely. These days, I still see them sometimes. Conversations are polite. Surface level. Careful. Nobody brings up the past anymore. Maybe that's their way of keeping the peace. But every now and then I still catch myself wondering about something. When someone is betrayed in a way that changes their entire life, is forgiveness the most important thing? Or is it reasonable to expect the people closest to you to stand firmly on your side when it happens?